Hey guys, this is Meeker here, back with another video. This one is going to be talking about the PTR gem setup, in particular, how you should be thinking about warding on the PTR versus how it's different on live. So on live right now, typically you aren't scared of the majority of damage from certain classes and you can ward versus very specific classes, and this is because you have access to Fortify that can cover the general cases. On the PTR, this Fortify buffer has been basically removed, but has been compensated for by damage nerfs across the board. What this ends up resulting in is basically a meta where we're going to have to be very, very keen on what we put our resistance to, because these resistances are one of the only sources of old Fortify, which is really, really important in terms of survivability. So in terms of like how you should be thinking about warding on this PTR patch versus this live patch, the main concept is you need to find what you are weakest to on your role, and then you need to exploit that by making yourself physically weak to the role that isn't as good in the position that you're playing. So this is going to sound super general, but basically if you're a healer off a point, you're typically not going to be swung on by as many melee classes. You're going to be mostly poked out by range. Depending on your region, this might not be the case, but I'm just speaking from an NA perspective. And an EU perspective, this might not be the case, and there might not be as many ranged people off a point, but there may be more melee people. So you would generally want to ward to those classes that are hitting you most. This is going to sound really like kind of five head, but you want to be warding to what hits you most. But I'm going to be talking about like some ways to kind of game the system here, and it basically comes down to how much Ellie aversion, how much physical aversion, and where you're playing on point two. So in terms of things that kind of break the game in terms of Ellie and physical aversion next patch, the main thing that people think of is, oh, I need maximum Ellie aversion to ward the fire staff. Yes, fire staff is very, very effective, but the thing is you don't have to stack as much fire ward if you have Ellie aversion, because Ellie aversion works versus every single fire staff ability that exists, as well as their basic attacks. So by doing that, you don't necessarily have to ward everything to fire, and you can get away with warding stuff to other classes. On the other hand of this, there's classes like Ice Gauntlet, which are completely counter elemental aversion, and nothing that an Ice Gauntlet uses in its typical kit is affected by elemental aversion except for basic attacks. So what does this mean? It basically means that if you were to say ward strictly to fire and ignore ice, you will literally be hit for from 6 to 8k by a single ice spike, which I think is going to be played a lot next patch because it gets around elemental aversion and it forces people to have to ward to other specific things. If this is not the case and people aren't running Ice Spike on your server, you can kind of ignore this. But what I imagine happening is a lot of people are going to realize, hey, everything on Blunderbuss and everything on Firestaff is mitigated by elemental aversion. So I want to kind of try to get around that aspect that other people are running, and the best way to get around that is to go Ice Spike, and you could basically force people into predicament where, hey, if they're running their fire, that's great, but you're going to be taking 6 to 8k damage from Ice Spike. So what this basically ends up leading to is a meta where people are going to have to ward in general towards elemental resistances and less towards physical resistances. Another thing to consider too is because of the run changes, things like detonate are no longer scary to use as like a more of a support class, and may even outclass vines, because vines is uh, Rend is no longer as good because that is new Rend, not old Rend, which means it's going to basically result in taking about maybe 3 to 5% extra damage from most classes. On a heavy player with max Fortify, it would be like about 6 or 7% extra damage, and is that really worth it? And most people would generally say no, so they're either going to go life-stealing vines, which doesn't sound super strong, or they're going to go to something like Detonate. And if they go to something like Detonate, that's going to be doing general Arcana damage, right? So you're starting to see like all these instances of a lot of things that it can break this elemental aversion happen to be other elemental types than just fire. It is noteworthy that detonate is weakened by elemental aversion, but say if you were to go physical aversion, then you'd be weaker to detonate. So I think it makes a lot of sense in general to do a heavy ward to elemental aversion and then substitute in an ice amulet, which sounds very, very strange on paper. But the reason why you would substitute in an ice amulet is because Storm, only the first tick is affected by the actual elemental aversion, and everything else after that does max damage. So if you're trying to cheat the system and you're like, hey, I have elemental aversion, now I can like reduce my elemental ward because I'm not going to be taking as much elemental damage, ice will chew right through that and it will hit you for very, very hard. So by doing that, you're effectively going to be warded well against fire because you have elemental aversion, and you're going to be warded versus other elemental types that can kind of navigate around that, like ice damage. And if you were to do a general ward instead of just a specific fire ward, then you would also be warded towards things like detonate, which are the main source of being killed, I imagine, next patch. Melees with having to up their con to 300 are going to be losing about I would say 10 to 20% DPS, but compared to the Fortify and with the other changes that can be a little bit higher than that, it kind of depends if melees, if knowing most melees are going to be running 300 con because they really like the grit, if that damage is significant enough to run in medium, otherwise they'll be swapping over to a heavy spec. If they swap over to a heavy spec, that damage will no longer be very significant, and that's something that we could start taking our slash ward away from and ward it specifically towards other specs. That being said, there is a circumstance here from the melee perspective and the physical gem perspective where bows still hit very hard. Even though they got nerfed, you have to compensate that nerf with the fact that Fortify also basically got removed, which basically means that bows are going to be hitting harder than they did on the previous patch, along with Blunderbuss, by the way. But the thing is Blunderbuss is warded by Elemental Aversion, so basically what this comes down to is some other YouTubers that I've seen have basically said, hey, we don't need all this elemental version, we can go physical version. And that sounds great until you realize that you are going to get chunked by detonate, you're going to be chunked by ice spike, and the fire damage you're going to have to sort of ward to. If you do a full elemental setup like I'm kind of recommending in general, then I think you can kind of get away with warding less towards specifics on the elemental side and say do 15 resistance across the board. But then ward specifically to some other specs. So I'm going to go over some like general cases of like different fortify amounts that you could use and like what they could specifically be good for. So like a general case fortify, say you do a 10-10 split right now, you have like you don't, or say you don't have any elemental version. If you do like a 10-10 split right now, you'd probably want a fire ward with your next patch. It's going to be the scariest thing. So that's like I don't want to think about it. I'm just going to play the next patch, not change my gear. That's what I would do. I would just swap your amulet to have fire ward and just call it a day, and you will be taking damage from everything, and it will hurt pretty hard, but you will still probably be able to live like decently well. And you don't really have to worry about the headache that's going to come from, hey, do I have melees on me? Do I have spears on me specifically? Are they doing thrust damage? Are they doing slash damage? Is this BB that's hitting me across the map doing more thrust damage? Is he doing fire damage now? Hey, this one guy in OPR is running musket still for some reason, but he's not running any elemental split. He's just doing thrust damage now because people aren't warding the thrust because they're all scared about the fire stuff. Like, there's stuff like that you have to think about, and that's where this general case can kind of get you out of that pinch, and you don't really have to worry about that kind of stuff anymore. I think a general element, like a general even split in terms of taking even damage from everything across across the board, and kind of a war or uh, a more competitive OPR perspective where people are actually running ice gauntlets, or is generally you do 15 physical, you do 5 elemental, you do 15 ice, and you run 5 elemental aversion. I think this is good versus most setups. I think the physical, even though it got nerfed, will be the main source of like kind of getting CC chained and getting blown up over time. It will also ward versus like natural thrust things, like Blunderbuss tends to also have the thrust, and the elemental aversion will be compensated for by or the lack of elemental that you have. If you only run 5 elemental, will be compensated by your elemental aversion that you could have. A good setup to run, say if you're on point, where you might be say a little bit weaker to spear, would be 3 to 5 elemental version. I'd still probably lean closer to 5, but I would say maybe 3. Say for this example, you have 3 elemental version, you have 2 physical version, something like that sort of setup, or maybe 4 elemental and one physical. That's a case where I think you do 15 slash, so you run the slash amulet like the current patch. You do 5 physical, and then you do 15%, or you do 15 ele. And the thing with that was you'd be strong versus bow, you'd be strong versus elemental in general. You'd be a little bit weaker to fire stuff because you have less elemental version, but you would be fairly strong versus everything except for spear, which is why this might be a decent setup if you're playing like on point. Because spear, if they're on point, will be running 300 con and will not be hitting as hard as some other melee classes. So this is something that you could think about trying. Personally, I would still prefer to go with like a 5 elemental spec, which would be very, very similar, where you run, I'd say, about the same setup across the board, but you consider maybe moving that slash damage to something else if you are getting hit by more of those things. I would still say 15 slash 5 physical, 5 like 5 physical in general, and then 25 fire, and then 15 Ellie if you are with a shield tends to be really good. That 25 fire, specifically if you're with the shield, could be useful because shields tend to be hit a lot by fire staffs, and that's something that can be kind of compensated for. It's just people tend to group up around you, and fire staff are looking to get those quick CDR uh, with the pillar of fire, and it's really consistent to hit an SNS. And even though it's padding, a lot of fire staff damage tends to get thrown your way if you're running a shield, which is why I would tend to run 15 fire or 25 fire. But in general, I think one of the better splits for the next patch would be 5 elemental. You do 5 elemental aversion. You do 15 slash 5 physical, so you have that physical amulet, and then you do 15 elemental aversion, and that will ward versus most elements. You'll be strong to fire. The only thing that leaves you open to is bow and spear, and I think bow and spear, even though they are strong, will not be played as much uh, in the beginning. I think bow is underrated and can be strong, but the thing with bow is you have to land very specific shots that you actually have to aim, versus fire staff can throw abilities with virtually no cooldown if you're using the CDR effects onto small clumps, and then you can basically hit the bow without and just focus on dodging. And I think that aspect will kind of push fire staff to be even ahead of bow in most circumstances, even at the range that bows typically like to play. And this will also Bordy versus Blunderbuss, and I think is in general is a good setup to go for. So like the two setups I would think about going for if you're in general from a melee or mage, like kind of short to medium range perspective, is 15 physical, 5 elemental, 15 ice, or 15 slash 5 physical, 15 elemental, depending on if you're getting hit by melees more or if you're getting hit by ranged more. And then you do this with 5 elemental aversion. If you're going to do something like 4 elemental aversion and then 1 physical aversion, and you're using those like new pieces to kind of go on a budget, then I would be dropping this slash a little bit more. Just accept that you're going to be like weaker to the melees, and then try to up your rate, up your general elemental. The actual physical version and elemental version is a little bit worse than doing the gem setups overall, just how the calculation works behind the screen. The reason why this happens is because physical version and elemental version are additive versus multiplicative compared to a gems when it comes to the actual damage calculation next patch. So gem setup is really, really important, but you can compensate to a degree with physical and elemental version. I'd say in general that physical and elemental version is worth about 75% of what the value says in total. So if you have 20% elemental aversion, that would in general be worth about 12.5 to 15%, but I just like round up to like 15%. It basically depends on how many empowers the opponent has. If your opponent is in power stacking, it will be worth less, and if your opponent is not in power stacking, it will tend to be worth more. But that's not including things like empower cap and whatnot, and that math gets really gross. But the base idea here, like the main takeaway, is try to ward towards things that are scariest most for your role. So if you're a healer, for example, the main things that are scary are bow, fire staff, and then maybe ice spike. I'd say melees in general are not as scary for your next patch, except for say spear. But bow and spear share the same element, right? They're thrust. So you could do something like 15 thrust, 22.5 fire, and 22 and then 12.5 elemental, and then it could be strong versus all those elements, and then they could do a hybrid setup of like 3 physical aversion and 2 elemental aversion to be good versus fire staffs and versus bows, or say versus more fire staffs to do more elemental aversion and less physical aversion. So that's like something that I think healers could really exploit next patch, just because there'll be less melees that are chasing them that are something like a Great Axe, because Great Axe kind of got nerfed across the board in terms of damage. And I think people will be leaning more into Spear because of that. It has able to get that thrust damage, and Spear overall just looks stronger next patch than some of the other classes like Greatsword. So really using that thrust damage to your benefit, and just warding versus thrust versus having to ward versus anything or versus everything physical, and just playing that range perspective so you're not getting hit by melees, that they could be really strong. There are some things that can counter this setup still, like SNS if you're playing it from a melee perspective seems decently strong next patch, and that could kind of exploit that setup. But I think in general doing something that is strong to fire and strong to thrust could be good, but I still think you need to do a decent amount of elemental to get around ice spikes. If you don't, you'll be getting hit from 6 to 8k with ice spikes alone, and then it'll be an easy finish with a neutral fire staff into fireball combo, and no matter how much HP you have, you're probably going to be dead from that. So you just have to be really, really careful next patch with what you ward to, basically because that ice gets around the elemental aversion, but as long as you compensate for that, I think in general the resistances won't be too bad, even with the lack of the buffer of Fortify. That being said, let me know what you guys think, and let me know if you have specific questions about certain matchups below, and I will reply to you guys, and have a nice day.